Right, in this video we're going to explore the topic of costing just in a little bit more detail. You remember the aim of costing is to find out how much of the costs that we incurred actually end up in the finished product. So we may actually, for example, here you'll see that we buy 7 square meters of wood, but not all of the 7 square meters will necessarily be in my finished products. So the aim of costing is to find out how much of the raw materials actually ended up in my finished product, but not just raw materials, also labor and also overhead costs. In this example, just to simplify the principle, we're just going to deal with raw materials, but just remember that it definitely also refers to labor and overheads. So we've got opening stock 3 square meters. So at the start we've got 3 square meters of wood in the storeroom. This is my storeroom. Then I've got the factory production line, and finally I've got my finished goods storeroom before we transfer the finished tables to the sales department. So at the start we've got 3 square meters in the raw material storeroom. We've got 2 square meters in our cutting department that's sitting there in the factory. When we open the factory at the beginning of the period, we see that there's 2 square meters that never finished basically the process and never ended up in finished goods. Alright, so that's the opening stock. Then during the period we purchased 7 square meters. There's my 7 square meters purchased, and we've got 4 square meters that is part of my closing stock for raw materials. So that will be what is left. Now what's going to happen is we're going to start off with an amount of wood at the beginning of the period in my storeroom. Then we're going to buy some more wood. We're going to issue some of this to the factory, and at the end of the production period we're going to make a lot of tables, and we'll be left with 4 square meters of wood in the wood storeroom. Right, and then just to look at the actual factory, the factory will have the opening 2 square meters. Then it's going to get some wood from the raw materials storeroom, and we still need to calculate that. And then it's going to make some tables, assemble them, finish them, and then it's going to transfer them to the finished tables storeroom. And there may be some wood that is stuck in this factory production line, and in this example we've got 5 square meters that is kind of stuck in the production line. We call that work in progress, and the 2 stages that this wood is stuck in is the assembly stage 3 square meters and the finishing stage 2 square meters. So I hope you just getting a picture and understanding of the flow in a manufacturing environment. There might be some goods in the raw material store, some in the factory, and some in the finished goods store. So there's the facts. How much of the raw materials end up in finished goods? So how much of this that we have here, this picture, actually ends up in my finished tables? So we're going to answer 2 questions in order to determine that. So here we go. Question 1 is, how much wood was actually used in production? So the first thing that we're going to have to calculate is how much of this wood here, the 3 and the 7, was actually issued to production. Right, that's the first question. The next question that we'll have to calculate is how much wood, raw material, forms part of the finished goods at the end of the period. So those are the 2 questions we're going to answer in order to determine how much of the raw materials ended up in finished goods. Alright, let's give that a go. So how much wood was used in production? We start with 3, and then 7 gets purchased during the month, or during the production period rather. And then we now have a total of 10 square meters of wood that is in the raw material storeroom. However, at the end, when we check our raw material storeroom, we see that there is only 4 left in the storeroom now. So the question is, what happened to these other 6? And yeah, there we go. So there's my question. What happened to this other 6 square meters of wood? So this other 6 square meters of wood, here's what happened to that. This 6 square meters was issued to the production department. So we started with 3, opening raw materials. Then we bought another 7, so in total we have 10 now. At the end we've got 4 left. So what happened to the other 6? It was issued to the production stage, to the factory. Alright, to calculate, so that's the first principle that we learned, to calculate how much of the wood that was used in production, in other words, my direct raw materials cost, you would take your opening raw materials, which was a 3, plus the raw materials purchased, which was a 7, and minus my closing raw materials, which is the 4, and that's going to give you the 6 that was issued to the production stage. Right, so that was the first question answered. Now that we know how much we have in the production stage, we've got 2 and we've got 6. There we go. The factory does say 6 square meters that was issued from the storeroom. However, we've already assumed that when we opened the factory at the start of the period, there was 2 square meters of wood in the cutting department. And this 2 square meters is not yet complete, and thus forms part of my opening work in progress. Great, so we know that. And this 6 plus the 2 is now available for processing, and we can actually make tables with this 8 square meters of wood, and that's what we're going to do. And after we've made the tables, we're going to transfer them to the finished goods storeroom. So we're going to make a number of tables, and once we've made our tables, we'll see that at the end of the period, 3 square meters was stuck in the assembly department and 2 square meters was stuck in the finishing department. So of the 8 that we started with, we still have 5 left in the production stage. The question is, what happened to the other 3? So let's just go through that quickly. How much wood raw material forms part of the finished goods at the end? So here we go, we start with 2 from the opening work in progress. Then we had the 6 that came from our raw materials storeroom, so that gives us 8. That's now in the factory. We're looking at the factory. So we've got 8 in the factory. At the end of the period, however, we're still left with 5 square meters in the factory. Question is, what happened with this other 3? Well, you guessed it, this other 3 was actually completed and is sitting part of my finished goods. So, of all the wood that we had here, the 3, the 7, the 2 and the 6, only 3 of the 3 square meters ended up in finished goods. So only this 3 will actually, the cost of this 3 square meters of wood is the only portion that will be included in the cost of production. Alright, and so that's the second principle. To calculate the raw materials used in the finished goods, important, the finished goods. So the first stage was to calculate how much raw materials went into the factory. Alright, and the second question was to calculate how much raw materials basically came out of the factory into the finished goods. So first, how much went into the factory, and then how much came out of the factory into finished goods. Right, so to calculate that, we took the raw materials in opening work in progress, plus the raw materials issued from the storeroom, which was the 6, that gave us the 8 in the factory. Then we calculated our closing stock, which is the 3 and the 2, which is 5. So this raw materials is still stuck in work in progress. In other words, this 5 square meters here is not yet complete, so it's not yet in this table. It's still stuck here in the factory. So we cannot include that in the cost of the finished goods, so that's why we subtract the 5 in order to get to our 3 square meters that actually ended up in the finished tables. Right, so here's just the overall summary again. Just notice here, notice how the raw materials or the wood could be stuck in any of the 3 inventory stock stages. Okay, it could be stuck in the storeroom, the raw materials storeroom here in the beginning. It could be stuck in the factory, in which case we call it work in progress, or it could be in the finished goods, but it might still not be sold, in which case it's part of my finished goods closing inventory. Alright, so principle 1, we first had to calculate how much went from the raw materials storeroom into the factory, and then we calculated how much went out of the factory into the finished goods. And both cases you'll see that we subtract the closing stock. Alright, closing raw materials subtracted there, and closing raw materials stuck in work in progress subtracted there. Right, And here's our shortcut then. Notice how the closing stock is subtracted at each stage. Right, we already talked about that. In calculating the raw material used in production or in the factory, we subtracted the closing raw materials, the 4. And in calculating the raw material used in finished goods, we subtracted the 5 that was stuck in work in progress as incomplete. These tables are not complete. So from your previous studies, you'll also remember that when we calculate our cost of sales, we also subtract the closing finished goods, because the closing finished goods is not yet sold, so we cannot consider it as part of my cost of sales. So that's just a shortcut. You can just remember that closing stock is pretty much always going to be subtracted when we're doing our production cost statement and our income statement.